Welcome back to Economy Disrupted. I'm Matthew Goodman, Senior Vice President for Economics at CSIS, and we're delighted to have you back with us. I want to just start by thanking our sponsor of this program, Howmet Aerospace Foundation. Thank you so much.
And I'm Sarah Ladislaw and co-host today alongside Matt. In this series, we examine 4 key disruptors shaping the U.S. economy and America's international leadership. We look at trade, technology, climate change, and shifts in the workplace.
This week, we're focused on economic disruptors in the great city of Fort Worth, Texas, and we're delighted to welcome the mayor of Fort Worth, Mattie Parker. Welcome, Madam Mayor.
Good morning. Great to be with you guys. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for joining us. We're going to start with a few questions of our own, but I want to remind the audience that toward the end of the show, we will take audience questions. You can submit those via the button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to take as many of those as we can. But first, before I turn to Sarah to ask the first sort of big question, let me ask a more broad question, Mayor Parker, which is, tell us a little about Fort Worth, because most of us, including me, I'm afraid, I've been to the airport, but I've never been into Fort Worth. So tell us a little bit about the city and what makes it tick.
Yeah, Matthew, I would say your situation is not uncommon for us to interact with. We're now the 12th largest city in the country. But when you survey Americans across the United States, they think maybe 45th or 50th, just based on size. They really know Dallas first. We're working really hard to change that. And there's a variety of things we can get into today as to what I think is helping Fort Worth kind of emerge as our own identity. But it's a fantastic city right there in central North Texas, a part of a booming metropolis in North Texas. By the way, North Texas is expected to surpass Chicago in the next several years as the 3rd major metropolitan area in the country. And you mentioned DFW Airport, which is a huge hub and success for us. But Fort Worth is this interesting microcosm of cultures, in which I think really bodes well for our future, an incredibly diverse community and growing so every single day. The census told us that as well. A young city, average age is around 33. We have a wonderful art scene. We're kind of known for cowboys and culture, the Fort Worth Stockyards, the Starkstone Rodeo, Dickey's Arena now. So when you come visit here, I think you'd be surprised. And that's usually my goal is people just come to Fort Worth and see what we're all about. And truly our visitor economy has helped put us on the map first, and then letting business sort of take second seat necessarily because people didn't know who we were. And as people and companies really are moving from your coastal cities across the country, you're starting to see a lot of Midwestern cities, Fort Worth as well, has come out on top as a place where people want to live and work and raise a family for sure. Population's probably around 920,000 people. The 2020 census we felt was fairly accurate. I mean, you've seen a lot of reports in the last several months about, undercounting, especially in our Hispanic populations. But we were pretty solid about the process that we undertook here in North Texas. But you're a part of this huge metropolitan area that helps us successfully from a variety of business angles. And then lastly, I would just say, Fort Worth's a really kind, welcoming place. I mean, I think you can, no matter who you are, you can land here and feel like you're welcome, start your business, raise a family, which I know is not the case in every city. And it's interesting when I interact with folks from across the country that have moved here, that's one of the first things they remark on. Like, people hold your door open. They want you to be successful. They want to exchange phone numbers. They actually want you to, they'll take the proverbial casserole on a Sunday. Even though we're 12th largest city in the country, it often has that small town feel, which I think people appreciate more and more now, especially after COVID.
That's wonderful. Well, thanks for that overview, Mayor Parker. I wanted to jump in to our first tranche of questions focusing on climate change and energy. So it kind of goes without saying the current security situation between Russia and Ukraine has caused already high oil and natural gas prices to rise even more. Oil continues to be a major industry in the Fort Worth metropolitan area and Texas as a whole. How are you balancing sort of new oil production opportunities in the Fort Worth area with your city's climate goals and also maintaining energy security and affordability for Fort Worth residents?
Well, you hit on it, and it's important to note that we are really, as a world infrastructure, facing a crisis right now. And Texas and the United States have to focus on energy independence, but it has to be diversified, right? And for Texas specifically, around 30 to 35% of our budget is really in that oil and gas arena, almost $16 billion in revenues every year for the state of Texas. That's huge money, and supports hundreds of thousands of jobs in the North Texas economy more broadly. Fort Worth's story is really an oil and gas story. But if you fast forward to today, some of the most innovative companies that are really technology companies, oil and gas companies merged together, are headquartered in Texas or even in Fort Worth. And that bodes well for our future. These companies are thinking about cleaner energy, natural gas burning, all the things that you have to do to create energy independence, still a reliance on oil and gas, but also thinking about the future of energy more broadly. As a mayor, I thought this before when I was in government and policy work, but I feel it more so ever right now. There's a lot of topics about climate change that you hear about internationally, which are incredibly important. But when it comes to day-to-day work of a mayor, and I know y'all have interviewed other mayors, some of that feels very esoteric. Like, what could you really do on the ground in Fort Worth? But the reality is, Texas cities are no different than a city in Connecticut or where you all are in Washington, D.C. They're facing really basic environmental structures they have to face on, right? So you're talking about landfills filling up. What are you doing for the emergence of electric vehicles? Do you have enough electric charging stations? All of those issues are really city issues as well, that oftentimes are more nuanced and don't get caught in this climate change conversation. And the last thing I would say, Texas has also led the nation in renewable energy, solar and wind, of course, but that's not without its critics. I mean, if you go to West Texas, near the Lubbock area, you'll get competing opinions about what wind energy really means to their communities. And so I think it's important for any audience to understand any city that wants to continue to compete is thinking about all energy sources. But I'm very lucky here in Fort Worth to have some of the top companies and innovators, even in this oil and gas industry, that are thinking about the future of energy.
That's great. Thank you. And maybe you brought up sort of the pragmatic aspects of, what mayors have to deal with when it comes to energy and climate issues. Air pollution is certainly one of those issues. So, Fort Worth suffers from high smog and air pollution levels. What are some of the things that your administration is planning to do, whether it's, city infrastructure or how resources are used? What kind of impact do you think these new sort of green policies you're planning will have on bringing down the city's air pollution?
Oh, a few different things. We've tried to intertwine a focus on environment and our economic development strategic plan as well. So those things have to happen on a parallel path. I also get to brag about things I didn't even get to start. So our director of environmental services at the city of Fort Worth is fantastic. And he's started a variety of initiatives that really focus on how do Fort Worth residents feel like we're really on this path towards environmental sustainability and being good stewards of our environment. And that starts with little things like composting program pilots that we've started here in the city of Fort Worth to help families feel like they can be a part of the change that they want to see in their own communities. A lot of green enhancements across the city in resources, energy, and water. We have a really great working relationship with our water supplier, Tarrant Regional Water District. Water is a big source of concern for cities across the United States. Fortunately for us, there's a variety of different things we've done over the last 2 decades to plan well, and those partnerships are critical. We also have really good relationships with our state agencies that regulate, to your point, our air pollution issues and water issues, TCEQ most notably, and our water board at the state level. Great relationships there. My point in saying all that, we have to rely on the experts, right? So Dr. Wittenberg, who runs environmental sciences, he has a PhD in environmental science. If I want to make a decision about what our administration needs to do, I really need to lean on Cody's expertise in his department to help change some of those things. But it's not just in his department. We've also worked with our Transportation Public Works Department to slowly and methodically, we're an older city, convert all of our current street bulbs to LED. About 30% of that has happened so far, and we have plans over the next 10 to 20 years to convert all of them over. That's a huge energy savings for the city of Fort Worth. We have an environmental master plan in the works. Another notable thing we've done here as the fastest growing city, we understood really quickly over 50 acres per week were being converted into developed land. So we wanted to save our open spaces. So through an open space conservation program in partnership with the Land for Public Trust for Public Land, has created this mechanism for the city of Fort Worth to take general fund dollars and purchase land off the market to preserve it into perpetuity. And it's been incredibly successful. We're actually going to put about $15 million in this upcoming bond election that citizens can approve in May to do more of that. That's how I feel strongly about being good stewards of our environment here locally. And then the Trinity River, of course, which is really a jewel across our city. There's a variety of plans that are more focused on the future of the Trinity River, but all of those are grounded in environmental principles and cleanup efforts that have been really successful the last 20 years.
Super. Well, if we can shift gears a little bit, and I wanted to ask you about trade and investment, which are big topics here in Washington. In fact, trade is kind of a dirty word here in D.C. It's a very difficult political issue. But our sense from talking to mayors and governors is that the perspective out there is a little bit different, and that, while trade, can be disruptive, and particularly there are concerns about trade with certain countries like China that we're being taken advantage of, that actually on the ground, trade produces jobs. And I see that Fort Worth did something like $8 billion worth of trade, two-way trade last year. So it's a big part of your economy. And I guess I sort of have a two-part question. By the way, a lot of that trade seems to be with China. So I'm sort of have a two-part question, which is kind of generally what's the perspective there on trade, and then secondly, how do you think about, or how do people think about China in that context?
Well, I think for Fort Worth historically, because of our kind of foundation in aviation and defense manufacturing, we've always had an appreciation for trade relationships that maybe started with our diplomacy efforts across the entire globe. And who are we trading from a defense manufacturing standpoint? That's now broadened to every single sector. I mean, I can give you a lot of examples for companies here in Fort Worth that really rely on those trade relationships. What I think has changed, honestly, for Texas, or for Fort Worth specifically, and other cities across Texas, and the mayors I've spoken to, is it's a deeper appreciation for trade for our economies, but also how do you provide more assurance and sustainability for your local businesses that rely on trade that were disrupted because of COVID. And they're still in the middle of that with supply chain delays. And then when you add all the complexities right now, of course, with Russia and Ukraine, and where China fits in that relationship with Russia, you do have local companies that are concerned deeply about what that means for the future of their companies. So I think all in all, for us in Fort Worth, we're just listening on that tour. We do not have, candidly, the right international trade presence that we need to support local businesses. And I discovered that actually when I was on staff for Mayor Price during the very contentious conversation about NAFTA. We did a lot of focus on, okay, what does trade really mean between Mexico and Canada? It's a significant part of our economy, but it was very evident to me individual companies knew the importance, but not as an entire economy. And so what I have a real keen interest in helping us shape what that international trade relationship really means and how it can help support our economy into the future. And then the last thing I'll say, and I've learned this from small businesses and entrepreneurs, I'm holding a phone in front of me. This thing has changed everything, right? I don't care who you are, you can be a part of this larger digital economy. And tech has to be available to every single company, mom and pop, large company, for them to survive. And so what does a city need to do to help enhance those trade relationships with other areas that are really made possible because of the digital economy? So I think the nice thing is for Fort Worth is most people, regardless of the trade relationship, there's a deep appreciation there, especially in our silos. But we need to work better across the board to understand who are the top trade partners for Fort Worth and for Texas, and how do we enhance those relationships as well.
Great. Well, that's I think very smart. And in terms of the kind of the handmaiden, as it were, the sort of partner issue with trade is investment and investment. I think you have something like 300 plus foreign companies investing in Fort Worth from 40 different countries. So that's also an important part of the story. And I assume you want more of that because it creates jobs and growth. Are you doing specific things? Do you have policies? Are you taking trips to out to other countries to try and attract investment? And maybe, again, a slightly related point is the Biden administration has also been trying to encourage more production and investment in the United States. And different cities seem to have been vying for, some of these new big investments, some of which is big foreign companies like Samsung or TSMC, the Taiwanese semiconductor company. Are you trying to kind of make a play for any of that new investment? Big question about investment.
Yeah, that last question, absolutely. I mean, as a city that wants to emerge as a top place to do business, we have to think about those next level industries. And you mentioned semiconductor as one of those. We had a big announcement with MP Materials, which is a well-known international company focused out of California, but they'll have a presence in Vegas as well as here in Fort Worth. But if you take a step back and think about Fort Worth's history, we have a wonderful really best in the world, I would say, international sister cities organization that's based here in Fort Worth, with a variety of different relationships across the globe. So that's really how Fort Worth got started, right? Trade was always a part of our economy, but I think the local average citizen may not have realized the importance and criticality of those diplomatic relationships across the world. And if you take a step back now, it's never been more important because those connections were gone. I've joked with staff recently. We've kind of felt like a consul general office, and had a lot of diplomatic visits from other countries because they couldn't travel for 2 years. And everyone that walks in has a different story or connection to Fort Worth, the number of companies they're connected with, the families that are here, the number of people that are here. And so again, having a better understanding more broadly across our community is going to be really important. And then last thing I'll say, in Texas, economic development is a full contact sport. It's not uncommon for a Texas city to lose to another peer city in Texas. So yes, you have competitors across the globe, those people like Denver or Charlotte, Miami, but oftentimes Texas is our biggest competitor against each other because we've been such a strong economy for so long, 9th largest in the world, which is hard to believe. And so Fort Worth has to really differentiate ourselves economically as well, which we're trying to do. The other industry that I think is emerging, and I know that you've probably talked to other leaders about this, is specifically in your mobility innovation, and your EV technology, autonomous vehicles, autonomous trucking. And thanks to Alliance Texas and Hillwood, we're really focused on that industry as something we think will take Fort Worth to the next level. We want to be the hub for that industry across the United States and maybe even the world, situated at Alliance Airport. So lots of exciting things happening there as well. So that I mentioned that as kind of a way to kind of differentiate ourselves from other cities.
Great. Well, you've anticipated a question I was going to ask when we got to technology, which is this EV story, but you've just said it, so that's great. Let me just, before I turn back to Sarah, remind the audience that we welcome questions. Feel free to push that button and submit a question. We'll be taking a few of those after we've gotten through our questions. So back to you, Sarah.
Great, thank you. Mayor Parker, I wanted to turn to the issues around labor and employment. So obviously you've said, Fort Worth is one of the fastest growing metro areas in the country, but inside this broader region of Texas that's also extremely fast growing, which means you can compete with neighboring cities like Dallas and other high growth cities in Texas for talent and workforce. How is your administration working to attract and retain high skilled professionals in that kind of competitive environment?
Well, I think I'll tackle the how to attract for in a minute, but I think we first had to admit, and this is true across most American cities, is how are you training and how are you investing in the talent that's sitting in classrooms across your own cities? And America really has a crisis, whether we like to admit it or not, or how are we really evolving the K through 12 system to meet the needs from a post-secondary standpoint, credentialing standpoint for emerging companies today, what the careers of tomorrow are. We're woefully behind, period, end of story. So what does a city do like Fort Worth, which is a fast-growing place, where you do have issues of poverty and communities that have been long time disenfranchised? How do you invest differently in those communities to make sure that those students can make a living wage, have a successful career path in your communities? In Tarrant County, only about 22% of our students are actually making it through to a 2-year or 4-year credential. That statistic is pretty common across the United States in major metro areas. But what's uplifting about that is not every student needs to go to a 4-year university. As much as we like to think that that's the path for them, if you really look at the top companies right now, 48 of the top 50 career paths in the United States right now do not require a 4-year degree. They require some type of post-secondary credential. So that's number one priority for us, is how are we investing differently? And there's a variety of different efforts we're putting on the ground here across Tarrant County and Fort Worth to partner differently with our higher education institutions, including our community college, our local high schools, to help train our students differently and make our students feel like we're investing in them for the future, which is very important. And then secondly, you also know, as a fast growing city, places where people are moving into and companies that want to hire an attractive workforce, attracting talent is very tough. Maybe more difficult now than it ever has been because of the Great Resignation, and there doesn't seem to be any signs of that happening or slowing down. What it takes to attract a Gen Zer is very different for a company, as you probably have interviewed a variety of different people. They're pulling out all the stops. What does it take to attract top talent? And so Fort Worth is really working through our different chambers and our higher education institutions. So what it looks like, what do these high talented individuals really want to see? And really it's back down to quality of life. And so as the city of Fort Worth, if you can provide a high level of quality of life, I think it helps a company's ability to attract and retain top talent in a bigger way. And the third pillar of that is diversity of your workforce is incredibly important. I don't care who you are. You want to make sure you have a welcoming environment for all types of people to live in your community. And we've done a tremendous job, especially in the last decade, of really capitalizing on our diversity, meaning welcoming people, making sure people feel like all different communities, you have a place to live no matter who you are. And your business can also be successful here. And so I think from a quality of life perspective, as a major American city that's growing fast, if we keep on that pathway, I think it will help our ability to attract and retain top talent.
One of the questions that we've been asking different leaders from across the country is how the COVID-19 pandemic has affected labor and employment and sort of equity issues within that context in their area of jurisdiction. How has that impacted Fort Worth? And do you feel like you're on the other side of whatever impact that's had, or is it still a lingering issue that you deal with?
Well, at risk of giving you the wrong statistic, I won't give a certain number, but I remember at a certain peak time during COVID when unemployment was highest, when you looked at those numbers, I think over 50% were those that did not have a high school diploma. So it all comes back to how do you invest and train and make opportunities available for people that were most impacted by COVID. The second area I would say our small businesses are still reeling. Those mom and pops that really were on Main Street across America have not fully recovered yet. We did an excellent job in the city of Fort Worth for taking those CARES Act dollars and trying to grant them out to small businesses across our region. Over $30 million were given out of CARES Act grants. That was unique. As a community, we decided they could know what best they needed as a company to help them come back stronger and better. And then the last thing I would mention is when you think about workforce changes and how to better enhance, you have to do it in a multi-generational way. So if you've got a student in a classroom that you interact with on a daily basis, and you find out, maybe their parent only has an 8th grade education, or maybe they graduated high school, but they're in a job that they're concerned about keeping. How do you create adult learning opportunities for them as well? And I've been really proud of some of our local school districts to think about that differently as well, because you have a captive audience with a family. But if you don't think about it as a whole generational opportunity for the whole family, you're really not impacting at a high level as you could.
Excellent. Well, let me again shift gears a little bit. I mentioned that I wanted to ask a little bit about technology, and you anticipated my electric vehicle question. So let me ask about another sector, which is healthcare. That's also something that I think you've prioritized. In fact, last month, your government partnered with an investment firm called TechStarts to start a physical therapy focused accelerator program for local startups. And I guess you've got TCU there, Texas Christian University. You've got medical school. You've got the University of North Texas Health Science Center there. So, do you see healthcare as central not only to Fort Worth's sort of economic future, but to specifically your kind of entrepreneurial ecosystem and tech sector?
Yeah, absolutely. So the TechStars partnership really was born out of COVID. It came out of the brain of Dr. Michael Williams, who's now the chancellor of the UNT system. At the time, he was president of the UNT Health Science Center. He'd long had a passion for entrepreneurship and has supported at the university level a lot of different efforts across our community. But he also knew the ingenuity and possibility of human mobility, specifically in physical therapy. And he felt strongly as a physician, it was a field that hadn't taken off yet and hadn't been invested in from a technology perspective. And so the partnership with TechStars was really the city of Fort Worth, Tarrant County, UNT Health Science Center, and Goff Capital Partners. John Goff's a local, very successful businessman with a VC arm. And this investment was relatively small to get us started, but TechStars, as you well know, is worldwide known. We did not have an accelerator in Fort Worth previously, so they're just getting started here. We hope to have as an incubation for the next generation of human mobility and physical therapy technology innovation that'll happen here in the city of Fort Worth. That made a lot of sense for us to start an accelerator kind of in the healthcare field because of our legacy. You mentioned the TCU Medical School, UNT Health Science Center has had a long time relationship here in our community with their DO and other health administration programs. But we also have our medical district, which is incredible. Everything from Cook's Children's to Texas Health Resources, Baylor Scott and White, all situated in a central business district in the near south side, which is a really cool and funky area of the city where a lot of people want to live, work, and play. That medical district continues to be an economic hub for us as well. And we also believe a lot of emerging partnerships will continue. One in particular is UT Southwestern, which is based out of Dallas, now has a presence in the Moncrief Cancer Institute in Fort Worth. You're starting to see, because of our high growth opportunities, additional healthcare institutions that want to be anchored in the city of Fort Worth. And then we also have a fantastic county hospital system in JPS, which has been noted as one of the top employers in the country for several years running. So all of those organizations, institutions in Fort Worth continue to provide top-level medical care, but also is a huge economic driver for our community.
Excellent. That's really thorough and persuasive presentation of that important sector and how you're trying to promote that. That's great. The other tech issue I wanted to talk about, you held up your phone and talked about the importance of sort of access to the internet and to the digital economy. And I don't have the statistics in front of me, but I'm guessing you don't have full access for your citizens to broadband. Most of the other governors and mayors we've talked about have mentioned this as a challenge, that you're trying to get broadband access to all of your all the people of Fort Worth. So how important is that, and what are you doing to promote that and maybe broader kind of infrastructure that you need for your economy in the city?
I think it's critical, and I've been talking about this for months, that it's really a third pillar of a basic utility that cities and state governments and maybe the federal government need to be providing for citizens. You simply cannot interact for healthcare, for your job, for education without access to quality Wi-Fi broadband in your communities. So the cash infusion happened, right, at all different levels. And the state of Texas now is letting their comptroller, who's actually going to be in Fort Worth this week, I believe, tomorrow, to talk about the broadband effort more across the state of Texas, and how to deploy those resources both in rural areas, which is a very different conversation. There's plenty of rural areas across Texas that deserve and need those services. I grew up on a small cattle ranch about an hour from here, and my mom's Wi-Fi is about 3 times the cost it is for me in the city of Fort Worth. So she chooses just not to get it, right? That's not uncommon for a lot of people in rural Texas. But we're also focused in urban areas, Fort Worth included, to think about different pillars. So this is an oversimplified way of thinking about it, and I'm sure anybody that's in the telecom world would shake their heads a bit. But if you think about, there are families that simply can't afford internet, but still have to have it for basic needs in their families. So we have an initiative. We partnered with the Fort Worth ISD, our largest school district. We started during COVID, a community Wi-Fi initiative. It's small in reach. We focused on those neighborhood revitalization areas. We did a neighborhood improvement initiative over a period of years and said, okay, these are our top priority neighborhoods. We want to do free Wi-Fi in those neighborhoods first. Relatively smaller investment, not necessarily a long-term solution, but something we could get on the ground. So we've done that first. The second piece has been an effort. We have an RFP out right now to any technology company, the big guys or the small ones, new startups. What would it look like for you to deploy broadband across the city of Fort Worth and prioritize specific areas? So we're to be continued on that piece. But I'm hearing there's a lot of confidence from other cities that have done this. There's a lot of interest from different companies that want to do that. And then that third pillar is really partnering with our educational institutions. They did this during COVID. We were no different than other cities. How do you help students be successful online? You got to start with how to turn on the computer, which was a basic concern for a lot of parents. And second was, how do you power up the internet? And most of those were those individual hotspots provided by AT&T and Verizon and other companies at a discounted rate to school districts. There was a variety of federal funds that were passed down. Those efforts have been successful, but again, those are not long-term solutions. And so I know the state of Texas, I have a lot of confidence in our state comptroller, Glenn Hagar, to help us think about this as an economic issue, which it truly is as a state. And I'm excited to hear his conversation actually tomorrow here in Fort Worth. He's doing a traveling show across Texas to talk about specifically the future of broadband in Texas.
Great. Thanks. Sarah, do you want to start taking some audience questions?
Yeah, we've got a bunch of them coming in. I did want to ask one follow-up question, if I might, just on the last train of thought that you guys were digging into there, which is about infrastructure. You mentioned a lot about broadband infrastructure, but there's the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that's been passed by the federal government is now sort of a program trying to disperse funds to cities and states across the country for things like EV charging infrastructure or weatherization programs or hydrogen hubs or lots of different types of infrastructure. How does a city like Fort Worth engage with a federal opportunity like that? And where are the biggest places you see for that type of federal legislation to help with the infrastructure needs of Fort Worth?
So our Metropolitan Transportation Agency is really the North Central Texas Council of Governments, run by a gentleman named Michael Morris. He has a predominant name across the United States. He's incredibly effective, and he's done a fantastic job for the entire North Texas region to keep us on pace with the tremendous growth we've seen. I mention them because we won't be successful in any grant initiatives that we try to pursue as an individual city without the buy-in of both North Central Texas Council of Governments and of TxDOT. So we have wonderful partnerships across Tarrant County and with our Dallas partners as needed to ask the questions, what are those shovel-ready projects that are prioritized based on the prioritization of the Biden administration? A few good examples may be we have the East Lancaster corridor here in the city of Fort Worth. We have a dream of that being a mobility hub, both for bus rapid transit or the future of other opportunities in mobility that are more expensive, maybe light rail at some point, but also considering that as a corridor for economic development and revitalization. So we know those are priority projects that are possible here in Tarrant County. And that's just one example. There's many others that we're listing. So I think for any successful city, that's where you're going to be most effective to draw those dollars down. And importantly, a major agency like your North Central Texas Council of Governments, you mentioned like EV charging stations. Where to put those is really a demographer's question about where's the high growth areas where you're most likely going to have EV needs more quickly. Are you going to ask businesses to be a part of that equation? There's going to be city-owned facilities. That's a whole nother department that would have to be created. Those are long-term decisions that we really need the expertise of larger organizations to help us ask those questions.
Excellent. Matt, did you want to ask the first question?
Sure. Well, actually, we were talking about this before, and a questioner has asked something similar about your relationship with other mayors, because when we've talked to mayors like the mayor of Oklahoma City or Phoenix or Dayton, Ohio, they've all talked about the relationship that you guys have amongst yourselves and the lessons that you can share with each other about, how you're dealing with particular challenges. Has that been something true for you as well? And how do you go about, sharing best practices or ideas with other mayors?
Well, a few things. I've been in office not quite a year. It'll be a year in June. And so as a new mayor, my lessons learned and or feelings are different than someone that served for like 12 years. And I was mentioning before we got on air about my friend Mayor Fisher in Louisville. He's been mayor for 12 years. His experiences are quite different. But we just came back from South by Southwest and the Civic I/O conference. It was a piece of South by Southwest. And there were numerous mayors there. And actually, the U.S. Surgeon General did a session with us for about 2.5 hours. And I joked afterwards that kind of felt like therapy because all of us were talking for 2.5, 3 hours about our experiences, good and bad, what it's like to be a mayor. And that camaraderie is so important. It's just like any profession to find someone that has a similar job as you, a similar experience, be able to bounce ideas off one another is incredibly powerful. I would also say that in this partisan environment we're living in nationally and in the state of Texas, it's really beautiful to be able to have a conversation with another person that's in elected office that really doesn't care whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. We really have very similar issues across cities in the United States. And so that camaraderie to me is very important. U.S. Conference of Mayors does an excellent job, as does the big city mayors in Texas. Texas Big City Mayors, it was started numerous years ago. When I was on staff, it was an organization. And that consistency of meeting and talking about big issues that are faced across the state of Texas is also cathartic, but it's also really smart from a policy making. Like, what are we seeing in other cities that's really important? Or if we have legislative issues we want to tackle in future legislative sessions, doing so as an entire block, I think is a more effective from an advocacy standpoint than going in it alone.
That's great. Good to hear. Sarah, do you want to take one?
Yeah, for sure. So we've got another great question, which is, what are the challenges and downsides of Fort Worth's rapid growth? We've talked a lot about all the good things that come from it, but what are the things that are harder to deal with?
Yeah. Well, I think the number one would be transportation, mobility concerns. A lot of them were inherited, right? These are issues that probably started brewing 20 years ago. that we didn't handle appropriately. We're catching up, and we have the right plan in place, I'm confident, especially in our east-west corridors that connect our major interstates. We have communities, especially in the north of Fort Worth, that grew so rapidly without the infrastructure in place needed, that some of my fellow council members that's a number one issue for them. They're continually asked by their citizens, what are you going to do about infrastructure challenges? The second piece, as I've talked about already today, was education. The good, bad, and ugly of trying to educate a growing community. Where you have, in Fort Worth, we have a very high percentage of young children, which is wonderful, but you really need to think about that from a cradle to career perspective. And how are you making sure you have a workforce that meets the needs of today and tomorrow? And you have to start really early. And so childcare continues to be a very difficult issue economically across the country, and Fort Worth is no different. I do believe, here's my statement, I'll throw it out there, that in Fort Worth and Tarrant County, the things we're doing specifically to invest in early childhood education will continually put us on the map and be a place that people are looking to for good policy making, because we recognize it's an intersection between quality education and also an economic and a workforce issue that supports your local economy. But we're not there yet. And I mention it because if you interview small business owners or people trying to get back into the workforce or trying to survive in the workforce as parents, childcare often comes up as the top issue that they have, especially in a fast-growing city where there's so much competition for those coveted childcare slots. And then the last thing I would mention is, I wouldn't say it keeps me up at night right now, but growing crime concerns and how to tackle those in a really smart way. I'm thankful for my other peer cities across the country. I'm thankful for my police chief, Neil Noakes, and our relationship. I have very, very high confidence they're tackling it in the right way. But in a fast growing city, it's a balance, right? You've got your areas of the community that still need to be served by police officers, and the rank and file that's needed to be added every single budget. But you also, if you have a rise in crime, how do you invest those resources and not spread them too thin across a growing city? So those are probably the top three things I would say about growth.
Great. Just shows that even things that are good also have their challenges associated with them. So there's another question in from the audience, a little bit sensitive about state politics, but you alluded to it. And, you said that Fort Worth wants to present itself as sort of welcoming and diversifying city. But some of the state politics in Texas, certainly from here, seems to be getting increasingly, polarized and may not be, so it may shine a bit of a different light on Texas at the state level. And I wonder how you kind of interact with the state politicians and how you talk about those kinds of issues, if you do at all, or is it just your separate problem?
Well, I have friends and colleagues across both sides of the aisle, so those relationships continue. And as mayor, I don't pick sides, right? I need to work with both parties. And even, I won't even just focus on Texas. If you just think about nationally, it's a little bit exhausting. It's hard to play whack-a-mole. I get very disheartened when any issue comes up and we automatically want you to partisan signal, right? You're either for me or you're against me. And there's no ability to have a debate. Like there's nuance to every single issue. And I think I feel that more acutely because as a mayor and a council member, every single issue has nuance, right? I can't get anything done without the peers around my table. I'm just one vote. And so there's this beautiful democracy in a local government that I think we've lost a bit at our state and national level because it just matters what party may be in power at the time. And then it's really funny because history repeats itself when the pendulum swings and the Democrats are in charge, the Republicans are in charge, and then everything gets stalled again. And so do I have a solution for that? No, I'm just maybe, expressing my dissatisfaction with it at times. And frankly, I try to think of it, I'll pick out things on a variety of even contentious issues and say, I could agree with this side on this issue and this side on this issue and pull them together, but we don't ever get that opportunity, right? Especially in media, they want the soundbite. And as mayor, sometimes I get a little frustrated about that because I think that most average people want more than the soundbite. It's just like they operate in their own families. There's not a dictatorship. You really have to have the conversation around the table to get somewhere. And there's never been a more important time in my mind than right now in the situation you're watching in Ukraine, that we need to have a better appreciation for decorum and debate and democracy more than ever. If we hope to come out of this and be an example for the world, then we really need to get our own stuff together.
Got it. Thanks. Sarah?
Yeah, another question that came in, how is Fort Worth working to alleviate poverty? So you've touched on this in a couple different ways, but maybe talk a little bit about what the poverty situation is like and how you're working to.
Yeah. So root causes has to be a predominant focus, right? So educational attainment is a key issue. Access to housing is a key issue. Transportation are key issues. So how do you work with multiple different agencies and organizations across an area to really combat poverty in those ways? We have a fantastic United Way here in Fort Worth that makes poverty alleviation a priority, as does Catholic Charities Fort Worth. Those are just two examples. There are many other agencies. And then I think if you think about, you can't relieve poverty one without the other. You also know food insecurity is a big issue. We saw that more than ever during COVID. And so how do all those organizations work together to alleviate poverty? The last thing I'll say, and I've seen it be successful in a variety of zip codes in Fort Worth, you can't tackle it broadly. You have to tackle it community by community, neighborhood by neighborhood, zip code by zip code. We started a process in Fort Worth, our neighborhood improvement initiative. We started in 2016 with a neighborhood called Stop 6, historically African-American neighborhood in Council District 5. It was just over $2 million invested in the neighborhood, everything from street lights to curbs, tearing down abandoned houses, additional code enforcement, security, including additional bike cops and police officers with the approval of the neighborhood. And you've seen those investments in a neighborhood also spur new investment, new jobs, new housing. And I think that effort has continued now for a multitude of years. Every year we choose a different neighborhood to be a part of that initiative. And that to me has shown so deeply the ability to change poverty in communities. If you don't think about it across Fort Worth, it feels almost insurmountable, right? 16 to 70% poverty rate. But if you think about it by zip code and try to tackle the challenges I mentioned, I think you really can move the needle. And then lastly, it's hard for governments to do this, but don't hide behind the data. Acknowledge it, know when it's going right, know when it's going wrong, and really try to make goals that are attainable year over year. And I think we've started that process in specific departments in the last several years I'm proud of.
That's great. Thank you. Well, listen, we ask this final question of every guest that comes on the program, which is, CSIS is a foreign policy oriented think tank. And we've noticed over the last several years that both the Biden administration, the Trump administration, there's been this real focus on trying to think about what foreign policy means to everyday Americans and really think about crafting our foreign policy around what does it mean for, the middle class, or what does it mean for people in the heartland of the United States for the U.S. to have foreign policy that does certain things. I just wanted to know, what does foreign policy that works for Fort Worth look like?
Ooh, good question. Well, I think right now, I had a conversation with my 11-year-old yesterday, and I'll bring this up because he watched a clip on whatever news program was playing in the background, and he's a very smart kid, and he had lots of questions about, what if I was trying to explain how far away Ukraine was and how proximity to Russia. And I mention that because our foreign policy stances and the way we work across the world have direct implications for our families, even in Texas, even in small town, anywhere USA, right? And I think it's more pronounced right now because of the situation in Ukraine. And then the second thing I would mention is, when you think about an international city like Fort Worth, and truly we are an international city, you don't have to throw very far to find a family that's connected across the globe, whether they're an immigrant from there, they have a family member from there, maybe they have a business in one of those places. And so maybe just a starting point of a basic appreciation for foreign policy, specifically in an economic standpoint of how that affects your local economy more broadly. And then again, diplomacy works. You see these wonderful programs that Sister Cities has here in Fort Worth. There's some really powerful examples, especially for our junior ambassadors that travel the globe in non-COVID times. I remember a few years ago, we had a series of baseball teams travel to Italy, and how special it was to watch those young men and women travel the country, talking about their experience, travel Fort Worth, talking about their experience playing baseball in Italy. And other than the funny food is what they mentioned and being really hot with no air conditioning, they had a wonderful time. And that's an experience that they'll never forget, right? And they don't have to grow up to be diplomats, but they absolutely have to have an appreciation for our foreign relationships. And I hope that as we emerge from COVID, we don't retreat, that we continue to reach across the proverbial aisle in our own countries, but also across the globe to enhance those relationships. And again, maybe recognize if for no other reason it's a good idea than your pocketbook. And economically, it's hitting us very significantly right now, especially with the situation we're facing in Ukraine.
Well, you mentioned sports, so let me just say something again we were talking about before we went on air. Congratulations to the Horned Frogs of TCU for their great performance last night. Unfortunately, it came up a little short, but
it's such a good game, though.
I'm sure everyone in Fort Worth is very proud. So, yes. Look, this is all the time we have today, but we really appreciate your coming on, Mayor Parker, and spending time with us. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having me. I'll take care.
Thank you. And thanks to our audience again for joining us. It's been terrific to have you with us. We're going to be back next on Thursday, April 7th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, when we'll be talking with Mayor Paige Cognetti of Scranton, Pennsylvania. So please come back and join us then. But for now, thank you all and have a great day.